So this is the latest in our series of place-based insight events. We've been doing a little scattergun tour around the country, looking at various different hotspots, and today we're looking at what we've referred to as West of England, which I believe is the West of England mayoral area, effectively, which is sort of very similar to but different from Bristol City region, because it focuses just particularly on Bristol, South Gloucestershire and Bath and North East Somerset. So what we'll be doing today is sharing a little bit about what we've seen and what we've got in various different data sets at the audience agency, from Audience Finder, sort of ticketing and survey data, from information about segmentation model we have, Audience Spectrum, and some other sort of secondary sources. So sort of looking at all of those different sources in the round, along with some insights from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is our population level survey, which has particularly looked at people's behaviour and attitudes, concerns and things during COVID. So that will hopefully give us a platform to have a bit of a chat about what all of that might mean for your local area, and for us to sort of have a bit of a conversation. So I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm Director of Evidence and Insight at the agency. And I should say, although it's probably my voice you'll be mainly hearing in the course of this, loads of the work behind it has in fact been done by my colleague Elise, who's you probably see on camera, who's waving. So all the credit goes to her, all the blame for how it's expressed comes to me. So just other little bits of admin as just before we start. If you want transcription, it's there in the automatic version. We don't have live transcription today. But do feel free to use that. If you can have your mic off unless you're speaking, that would be great, but do feel free to chip in with questions, comments, clarifications, examples of how it relates to your own experience, either in the chat or indeed in person on the way through. That would be great. My colleague Elise will be keeping an eye on the chat just to make sure that we pick up things as we go through. By way of audio description, I am a white male, blonde hair, blue eyes, which you may or may not be able to see depending on the size of the camera. And I'm sitting here up in Sheffield, but finding it kind of interesting doing this event because Bristol's just on the kind of edge of the world I grew up in, because I grew up in Berkshire. So every now and then, with doing the analysis of this, I'd see places and go, oh, that's where my godmother lived, or that's where my grandparents lived, which is always quite nice. Nice to do. So for me, it's a bit of a virtual adventure, or a return, really. But obviously, you will know this area much better than me. So as we're talking through, do feel free to kind of layer in your knowledge and insights. So without more ado, shall we crack on? See what we found. So here's our set list. Not actually that set list. But what we're going to be covering is a little bit of stuff looking at the local area and population, looking at audiences, and that's from the Audience Finder data. So what we've seen about people who actually have been attending things. And often when we're looking at that, we are looking at the kind of pre-pandemic period. So to kind of keep clear of all the kind of strangeness and changes and absences and things that happened during that window, but looking at the kind of what's the background behaviour and tendencies. But also layering in that stuff from the population monitor, which will give us a little bit more stuff more recently. And I'll say more about that monitor and stuff in a minute. And yes, and do please share your own thoughts. And we've got a little bit of reflection on what we think it might mean. And in some ways, because we've been doing a few of these now, I think this is the fifth local event we've done. We're starting to get a bit of a picture about the commonalities and differences we go around the country. So we've done, Cumbria, Lancaster, East Midlands, Hampshire, I'm sure Newcastle and Tyne and Wear, and now this one. And I think in some ways Bristol is coming out as a bit distinctive, which no doubt will be no surprise to those of you who live in Bristol, which is kind of, I guess, famed for its independent mindset. And indeed, lots of people in Sheffield, where I am, kind of often treat Bristol as a little bit of a kind of twin city. It's got lots of things in common in terms of independent culture, lots of hills, high concentrations of university students, etc. So yes, it's sort of home from home, if you like. So we are going to be looking at all of these different data sets all interleaved here. And so by way of illustrating it, and as another little insight into my strange psyche, we've got a reference to a bit in a novel by James Joyce, where the main character, Stephen Dedalus, sits there in class and does the thing which I'm sure all of us have done at some point. And indeed, I saw my own kids doing the other day, which is where you kind of start to spell out your address, where you live, and just kind of pan out all the way. So you start, so in this case, it's like, it's me in this class, in this school, in this place, in this county, in Ireland, in Europe, the world, etc., and panning out. And we're doing something equivalent with different levels of data sets. So different types of data apply at different levels. So we can look at overall national picture through the cultural participation monitor, but we can even split that down to regional levels, albeit with a smaller sample. And of course, we've got audience spectrum as a description of the whole population, which we can talk about in that kind of quite big aggregate level, but we can also get super granular with that, and we can get that right down to, well, indeed to the household level, but in this case, we're going to go down to the ward level, so sort of local wards. And indeed other bits of information which we can kind of do at different levels in between. So for example, audience finder data, because we've got literally tens of millions of households in Audience Finder now, and 1 million surveys, which is a slightly mind-boggling number, it means that we can then split that data down more or less geographically, locally, and start to look at particular differences. So that's what we're going to be doing. So at various different points, we'll be toggling between these different levels. And this is specifically the area we are looking at. So yeah. So everyone happy so far? Any questions? No, all looking good. Okay. Now, much of what we talk about today is going to be from audience spectrum. So some of you may be more or less familiar with audience spectrum. Indeed, it might be possible for those of you who are on camera, could you just give us a quick show of hands of whether you are familiar with it or not really. So yes, some are, but some aren't. Okay. So what I'll do is I will do a little bit of a description of audience spectrum and what it is. Obviously, for some of you, this will be telling you stuff you know, but otherwise, I think it would be a little tricky to follow the rest of it without knowing what we were talking about. So audience spectrum as a whole is a way of splitting the whole population into one of 10 groups. Aha. So yes, so I'll pick this question up straight away. So do area profile plus reports, what kind of area do they focus on? Don't worry, it's good to interrupt, keeps it conversational. So the area profile plus reports, I think there's a sort of a limit to how big they can go, but that's because they contain really granular local information. So I think we can do them to regional level, he says, looking at Elise, who will contradict me, no doubt.
It depends if you're looking at APR plus, which will have data usually at postal sector level, in which case we limit for the normal price of the APR plus to about 200 postal sectors. So not regional level, but a normal APR that doesn't have a split at postal sector level, you can have it absolutely any area size you want, even regional or combination of regions.
No, it was just
so just to clarify for those who may not be familiar with them, area profile or APRs, as they're known to their friends, are summary reports that kind of aggregate secondary data about particular places. So it'll be things like the age profile, ethnicity, education, audience spectrum, and various other things, grouped together either overall in a standard APR or split out at that level that Elise talked about. And you can choose different levels of the lowest geography. So you can do it at ward level, you can do it at postcode sector level, depending what geography you use in-house. For these conversations where we're using data, we're generally using it at ward level, just because ward descriptions are a little bit easier to get a handle on. They feel like real places, whereas postcode sectors starts to feel like the kind of thing that only slightly nerdy researchers sort of start to recognize them by name. But yes, they are potentially a really useful tool. Yes, yes. Our research team are occasionally allowed to stop for food, but we try not to encourage it. Fab. So, audience spectrum. Oh, yeah, who's having a tricky time? Audience spectrum splits the whole population into 10 groups of people, and it's based on, typically speaking, how people engage in arts and culture. So it was originally built based on the Taking Part survey, which is a big DCMS supported and the Arts Council endorsed survey that looks at who does what types of activities, what their reasons are, how often they do them, are there particular barriers, what are the demographics, all that kind of thing. And so we took the data from that and grouped people into 1 of 10 groups based on the types of stuff they do and how much they do it. And then we looked at where typical groups of, where the different groups typically live, and used that to be able to basically model out this segmentation model onto the whole country. So essentially, if we have an address, a postcode, a household, whatever, we can predict which of these groups they're most likely to be in. Obviously, it's a bit fuzzy on the individual level, but once you start aggregating it up into big groups, into a few hundred in postcode sectors or bigger, we start to get a kind of an overall picture of this big, this data set will typically contain this proportion of these types and this proportion of these types, and so on. So we've got the information that describes the types, we've got the where they all are, and then we can use those two in combination to kind of describe different people and different locations. So that's the overall idea of it, but more specifically, the model splits people, broadly speaking, into higher, medium, and lower engaged groups. Groups that typically will engage higher, medium, or lower amounts. So those that typically engage higher amounts are in one of these 3 segments here that I've highlighted in orange, and broadly speaking, they are starting from metroculturals, who are the super highest engaged. So they tend to be sort of quite affluent professionals engaged in a wide variety of art forms. Often they're really cherry picking the best of whatever they want to see. And they're heavily concentrated in London. And so normally when we have this kind of conversation, when looking at an area outside London, we say, that's all very well, but we kind of leave them to the side. One of the things that makes Bristol and Bath distinctive is that that isn't true for you. And we'll come back to that. So there are some of these around. There's also big swathes, as we'll see in a sec, of this group called commuter land culture buffs, who tend to be a bit more out in the so-called commuter belt, but again, relatively affluent, a little bit older on average, a little bit more traditional in their taste on average, really core kind of regional arts audience in general. And then the other of the highest engaged groups is this group called experience seekers. Now, the experience seekers are quite an interesting group in all sorts of ways. They have lots of things in common with the other higher engaged groups. They tend to have very high levels of educational attainment, for example. They tend to be in professional occupations. They tend to be urban, albeit sort of on the edges of cities. But they also tend to be younger, and so they are a bit more price sensitive. And as a result, they sometimes drop in and out of the profiles of arts engagement to a much stronger extent than you would find on some of the other segments. So, free, very contemporary events, they're much more likely to be there in high numbers, less so for other things. And the other notable thing about experience seekers in this instance is that you have absolutely loads of them in your local area, an absolute ton. And we'll come back to that. But this mix, particularly in the context of COVID, is going to be really important, because we've looked at which segments are most likely to be happy to come back and to engage more post-COVID, and metrocultural experience seekers are a really key part of that blend. And you're richly furnished with those. So it could be, another way of looking at it is that Bristol could be one of the places where the future of the arts is really built in this country, in the sense of having enough of the audience types who are going to be most active in future, that the models that you're developing in terms of how to engage these groups could be what other places need to follow. So then we have middle engaged groups. Again, of which you have interestingly high concentrations of some of them. So trips and treats tend to be sort of young families in more kind of small town areas. Dormitory dependables, possibly slightly older families, slightly more mainstream in their tastes. You know, they do various bits of arts and culture, but not as a kind of absolute priority. And home and heritage tends to be a bit more traditional, a bit older, more of a heritage skew, more of a kind of national trust attender type vibe. Really big in lots of rural areas, quite prominent in the southwest as a whole, not prominent in this area that we're talking about. So worth noting as well that sometimes when you see data that's, you know, about the southwest, this is the group that could be skewing it when you start seeing how you're different. So there'll be more of them elsewhere. Okay, and then finally we have the lower engaged groups, which are of various sorts and various characteristics, but ranging from up our streets, which tend to be much more kind of settled communities, often in kind of urban terraces. You've got little pockets just to the east of the centre of Bristol from memory. There's lots in like the sort of northern cities, but they tend to, you know, has a bit more of ethnic diversity within that group, but it does tend to be communities who've been sort of in the same place for 30, 40 years, or, you know, often people are living in the same houses. You've got kaleidoscope creativity, which tend to be kind of younger people, often living in flats or some council accommodation in the mix there. Again, very urban concentrated in terms of that group. Facebook families, which tends to be kind of lower income family groups. So, you know, lots of motivations. In as much as people are engaging in arts and cultural activities, it tends to be driven by families, and it tends to be very, very price sensitive. And then heydays, which tends to be particularly restricted in terms of age and ill health, but with a tendency to be living in either sheltered or kind of managed accommodation of some sort. Okay, so that's a little bit of a run through of the segment groups, with a few hints about what we're going to see about them in a sec. Okay, everything fine so far? No questions before we dive into the actual facts about what's going on, as opposed to just amble. So now we have ambled greatly. Just to flag a couple of other bits about audience spectrum before we move on. For those of you that want to know more about how it's built, it's broadly speaking, as I said, based on the Taking Part survey. We did mix in some other ingredients, like how far people live from cultural infrastructure, because we figured that matters. It affects what you can do. But it also has all sorts of other data sat behind it. So it was done by Experian, who you may know from their sort of credit check service, but they have loads and loads of data about all the households in the UK. So it's using that data set. It's using population and census data and secondary data about, you know, roughly speaking, who's where, of what type. But of course, as we've used it as our common language between all the different activities and services and analysis and data sets that we use, we've then been able to enrich our understanding of all the groups based on what we see coming back from the surveys and ticketing data and whatever else. Which is summarized on our website on these pen portraits, which are in the process of going through a bit of a refresh. But this gives you an overview of what each segment tends to be like, what they do, what they're interested in, how to reach them, where they're based, some a little set of stats you can download, a file there on the top left. And you can get this for all of them, as well as for each of them. Oh, there's a mapping tool in Audience Finder, which is freely available, and you can just go in and say how many of each segment live in any particular postcode sector. So if you're looking to do a campaign in a particular area, you can zoom to that area and you can select the different segments to see which people are in that place. And then you go to the profile and say, well, if it's these people, what do they do? What are they interested in? What are the barriers likely to be, etc. Okay. So moving on. So what we're going to look at in terms of, looking at local population and then local audiences. So in terms of population, we're going to touch in on some demographic stuff, and then we're going to look in more detail about audience spectrum, and then pull out some things from the cultural participation monitor, at which point I'll explain that more detail. At a population level, in some ways, this might just be because I'm getting very used to looking at the demographics of particular places, but in some ways it very much paints a picture you would expect. Bristol being, having several universities in situ, has a spike amongst 25 to 34-year-olds. You see that in large cities anyway, but notably fewer fewer in South Gloucestershire in the 16-24s. So if you're looking for younger groups, people are having kids in those areas. They've got under 16s, but once people start hitting kind of mid to late teens, etc., the proportion's much lower, and the proportion of older people is lower in Bristol than it is in other parts of the area. So far, no great surprise. It's also the most ethnically diverse of the 3 areas we're looking at, but even so, not radically diverse. Obviously, there are substantial pockets and substantial communities, but broadly speaking, it's actually pretty white compared to lots of the other cities, I think, around the country. Nonetheless, I'm aware, obviously, there's all sorts of racial politics, which is more active and live in Bristol than perhaps many other places, shall we say. Obviously, big concentration of population out of this whole area in Bristol itself, which you would expect. But actually, South Gloucestershire, despite the fact it doesn't have much in the way of major settlements, like the really big towns, there are actually, it's quite a big population within that hinterland, all things considered. A third of a million people, or just over a quarter of a million people. So of course, we already mentioned fewer younger people, a lower proportion of students, and that's high in both Bristol and in Bath as well. Bath, depending how northern I'm feeling today. Here, however, we get onto the audience spectrum profile. So this is for all 3 areas put together, and it's looking at west of England, or we sometimes refer to it as Bristol and the surrounding area. So all 3 of these areas compared to the southwest, compared to England as a whole. We'll also then look at those 3 split out in a second. So just as an overview for the time being, we can see absolutely loads of experience seekers, sort of double the proportion across the country as a whole, double the proportion in the southwest. So the southwest is pretty typical for the whole country in terms of that group, but this particular patch of the southwest really, really high for those groups, and almost uniquely for somewhere outside London, above average for metroculturals, which is kind of an interesting one. And we also see quite a lot of these, particularly these first 2, the middle engaged, often family, not exclusively family, but often family groups. 1 in 5 of the population are in this trips and treats group. So roughly speaking, in fact, you've got 1 in 5 trips and treats, 1 in 6 experience seekers, 1 in 7 geography dependables. Between those 3 groups, that then adds up to half the entire local population are in those 3 kind of groups. And then you've also got substantial numbers of community culture, substantial numbers of metroculturals. So in terms of being a relatively easier audience catchment overall compared to many places, I think it's safe to say there are quite a lot of opportunities, albeit with particular concentrations, particular distinctive attributes, if you like, skew towards families, amongst middle engaged groups, skew towards more contemporary, more varied tastes in terms of engagement with new metroculturals and experience seekers. There are still substantial concentrations of other groups, particularly Facebook families, but it is still below average for the country as a whole, even if it is above the southwest. Okay, now we get to a more granular picture, and we get an even more extreme split in terms of what we're looking at. So we mentioned that we had 1 in 6 population experience seekers. Once you look at Bristol itself, it's more than 1 in 4, over 10% metroculturals as well, And indeed, that's where the big concentration of Facebook families are in the region. So again, almost 15%. On the other hand, South Gloucestershire, it's that big kind of commuter belt, sort of lots of suburban families, and you can see those two really big spikes. So 55% of the population within just those two groups in the middle engaged group. So lots of potential there, but it's for very particular types of kind of broad, popular, family engaged, kind of readily appealing kind of content. And then Bath is quite interesting. You do see reasonable concentrations of metrocultural experience seekers, but even more of the commuter land culture buffs. So this is where the kind of high engaged but more rural groups are in particularly high concentrations. And indeed, we're looking at almost half the population being in high engaged groups in Bath, which I think is kind of quite interesting thing. So obviously lots of opportunities there in terms of engagement. We'll also see that Bath is behaving in some interesting ways relative to Bristol and relative to London, which will make more sense when we get to it. But yeah, it's an interesting picture. So here, what we've done is we've zoomed in on the local area and we've color coded each ward. So ward as an electoral ward, color coded by the segment which is most prominent in that ward. So the segment of which there are more in that ward than any other segment. It doesn't mean it's a majority. It doesn't mean there aren't substantial numbers of others, but if you're looking for the one type of audience spectrum group that was most prominent in a particular place, this is it. So we can see here this big red band is the commuter land culture bus. So it's further out from the built up areas, potentially very highly engaged groups, big concentrations around Bath. And Bath doesn't really have what we do see in Bristol, and indeed as we push down towards Somerset, these pockets of trips and treats who are kind of round, sort of ringing the city of these kind of with engaged family types. You don't really get that so much in Bath. It's either the highly engaged groups concentrated in the centre, metroculturals, experience seekers, community land culture around them, and not much else in terms of that overall picture. Now, as I'm sure you will know, and this is another little parallel with my hometown, well, my new hometown, Sheffield. Bristol is a very split city in terms of demographics. So you see a strong skew towards the west of the city and the west and north, Clifton, etc., of metroculturals, of lots of experience seekers slightly closer in. And then if we look further to the east, we see, yes, lots of these trips and treats, but we also see the odd little pocket of kaleidoscopic creativity, which you remember we said was often in sort of urban central flats, and up our streets, some of the sort of up our streets, sorry, the more settled communities just to the east of the centre. So there is a bit of a mixed picture, and indeed, there's Facebook families throughout in reasonable proportions, but particularly as we get down towards sort of it's called Avonmouth, I think, up by the estuary. So that's the overall picture in terms of the population and how the land lies. And I should say we'll share all these slides with you, so you can look at this in more detail if you want to. And for some of the slides, we've got sort of secret hidden slides which have the actual numbers on. Not this one, but some of the others, so you can look up more specific. But this is what people look like if we just look at people who are booking as seen through audience finder data. Now, I should say, in terms of the audience finder data we're looking at, we are looking at anyone from this area who's booked for anything anywhere across the country and in the audience finder data set. So someone from here booking in London or booking in Birmingham or wherever will still show up as a booker. It's just, so we defined it based on the people, not based on the set of venues. Although, of course, people are more likely to attend locally, as we'll see. So looking at people from these areas and which segments are booking most in a given area, essentially it's in many ways very similar to the picture we saw before, Indeed, if you look at Bath, it looks pretty much identical. But there's more of a concentration in the higher engaged groups. So there's some areas where they kind of take over as being the most important group, where they're not the most, the most prominent in the population, but they do then rise up in terms of booking. So, for example, that patch of experience seekers to the north and west of Bristol is now kind of quite a big uniform patch, where it was a bit more speckled. You see the kind of commuter land culture bus ring has sort of expanded outwards. It's kind of swamped some of the dormitory dependable bits, some of the sort of browny, whatever colour that is, taupey kind of colour. You do still see some particular groups like trips and treats. There is still quite a big band of those groups engaging. But if we just flick between them, you can see that it's just that sort of centre of slightly more sort of greater encroachment into the centre, the sort of solidification of these kind of key audience types. So it depends, I guess, whether you're looking at the local area in terms of who's there or who's booking. You get these sort of two different impressions. But broadly speaking, you do get this clear geographical split that we've mentioned, quite a strong contrast between the kind of city and beyond, and Bath being fairly concentrated. And of course, things breaking up and being a little bit different as we get further down into Somerset. Despite the fact, as far as we can tell, those aren't particularly built up areas. It's just, those particular rural areas tend to have slightly different character. Okay. So, if we now look at where the different groups are based in general, so this is just looking at the whole population, not because just people in general, you can see that we're going to look here at those three largest groups, the three groups that make up half the population. So for dormitory dependables, so again, this is kind of middle engaged, medium to higher income, tends to be more kind of, more rural, as you can see, really very low concentrations in Bristol and Bath itself, but much more to the extremes. St Treats has this very distinctive kind of ring around Bristol, skewed to the east, and then a little pocket down in the more rural areas at the bottom, where it's a high proportion of households, but there aren't that many households there, which we'll see in a sec when we look at families in general. And then experience seekers, super concentrated in the urban areas. Again, skewing west of Bristol, and then fairly concentrated throughout Bath. So, just the final one of these little visualizations of the local population, we see quite an interesting picture when we look at the distribution of families. They're pretty even across the piece, all things considered. There are some little pockets, but it's apart from those really concentrated in their areas, again, slightly west of the centre in Bristol, where we do see slightly lower concentrations. It's fairly broad across the piece, if anything higher when we get down into the south of the area. But when we look in terms of actual sheer numbers, rather than just proportions of local population, so where are most of the families, not just where are most of the households, families, if that makes sense. It's a quite different picture. So because the population is much lower in this areas furthest to the south, so if we go back, yes, there's a high proportion of people there who are family groups, but actually, generally speaking, the families are located much more up around Bristol and to the north, and indeed stretching out to the northwest. So we've seen how a couple of these family groups are really prominent, dormitory dependables, trips and treats, but where families in general are doesn't necessarily follow such a neat pattern. And mapping on audience finder, is that by booker or by population? So this, in terms of families, if that was your question, this is just based on population. So yeah, so this is just where the families are, not which one family is booking. But I suppose it's particularly worth noting that although some groups have more families in them, there isn't a neat map between where the families are and just those groups, because all groups have proportions factors one way or another. Okay, and oops, yes. So that was a brief overview of sort of who is living where. is there anything about any of that that surprises anyone or fits with your experience of your own audiences? You have particular areas where you would always sort of rely on or expect to get audiences from, or areas that you find more challenging, and how does that relate to what we've seen here? Does anyone have any thoughts? Oops, sorry. I'm trying to find get the chat to appear again. Elise, you might need to tell me if there's anything.
Nothing at the moment, no.
Okay. But hopefully what I'm saying isn't surprising in a bad way, as in the other thing we look at data and go, really? Is that the case? But no, hopefully this sort of matches your broad expectations. Okay. So I'm going to move on now just to say a little bit about data from the Cultural Participation Monitor. Now this is a population level survey that we've been doing right the way through COVID. I say right the way through, since October 2020. And we've done multiple waves of the survey. So October, and then the following, then February, June, September, November, and we've literally just sent the next wave to the fieldwork company to do. And it's designed to be representative of the whole population. We've stratified it by region and age, ethnicity, and whatever else, to make sure we're getting a really broad spread of everyone, with varying samples in each wave. But so far we've had like 17,000 surveys across the 5 waves. What it's trying to do is get a picture of what the whole population is thinking and feeling, and also a big enough sample that we can then start to look at particular subtypes within that. So are families behaving differently than people without families, or older audiences maybe for younger audiences, and so forth. We've also just about got enough data to do regional analysis as well. So we can look at what the picture in the Southwest as a whole is compared to the national picture. Now, with a caveat that we've already seen that the Southwest is a little bit different from this area, in as much as there's lots more of the home and heritage in them. So you've got all the kind of rural parts in the further Southwest that's changed the profile a little bit, but we can look at that overall. But we can also look at the trends that relates to the groups that tend to live in the cities. So we can kind of see what their picture is in general. So broadly speaking, we asked people in the monitor about their attitudes to COVID, as well as their behaviours. We'll see the behaviours in a sec. But we asked people relative to, if there was something on that you were interested in, would you be happy to attend? Would you consider attending but have reservations? Or, and these other 3 groups are essentially people saying they wouldn't be happy attending in one way or another. Either they want a loss of reduction or eradication, or just no, they're not interested. And broadly speaking, we've seen across pretty much all of those waves of the monitor, a third in terms of happy to have reservations and just won't. And that's been surprisingly slow to change. So this data is from just before Omicron. So again, there's sort of, we'll have to see in the next couple of weeks where people have got to now. But broadly speaking, we were still seeing this kind of a third, with the exception that people were getting a little bit more likely to attend. So it was a full third saying happy to attend, but it was slightly lower here in the Southwest just in general, albeit plenty of people who are saying they would consider it. Now, of course, if we were to restrict that just to Bristol, we haven't got the sample to actually show that in the data, but we know from the way that people are behaving in terms of cities and non-cities that probably you would have a higher proportion saying they're happy to attend rather than a lower proportion. But it's not wildly out of line with the overall population. And indeed, general attitudes are people think we should sort of throw the kitchen sink at getting rid of COVID, or just learn to live with it, or somewhere in between. It's fairly in line with the general population, a little bit more hesitant overall, But again, this is the whole of the Southwest. If you were to concentrate on just this area, probably it'd be a little bit the other way, but not radically. We asked people if they thought the COVID would still have an impact in 6 months, which would be in a couple of months now. And again, it's a higher proportion in this region saying yes, as opposed to no. That's partly because I think we saw quite a lot of Londoners who were quite quick to go, no, it'll be fine, relative to some other regions. Okay, we'll come back to monitor in terms of audience behaviours in a sec as well. So, everyone with me so far? This is all making sense. Is this useful? Yeah, good. Okay. So we can now look at some more information relating to local audiences. So who's actually booking, who's actually filling out surveys on sites, etc. Now, there's probably a couple of things we could do with mentioning in relation to this. One of which is, obviously, we've tried to keep, we're looking at the picture pre-pandemic, because post-pandemic, everything, obviously, everyone knows everything basically shuts, so yeah, sales figures just disappear. We do have some overall sort of national trends in terms of how things have been opening up, but the key thing to get the overall behaviour of audiences, we're looking pre-pandemic, but also one of the bigger venues in the local area, Bristol Beacon, was of course shut for refurb and indeed renaming during the period. So where we're looking at summary data overall, we've included any venues that are relevant. Where we're looking at trends, sort of year by year by year, we've excluded any venue that isn't present in all years. So in most obviously in terms of this data set, we've taken Bristol Beacon out. So we are still looking at members of the public, but members of the public attending what we call a consistent cohort of venues. So venues that, kind of exist across the range. Essentially what we don't want to do is see big fluctuations in the data and go, oh, people are buying more expensive or cheaper tickets or more tickets or whatever, when actually it's just because one particular venue wasn't there for that year. So, at a top line level, we can see there has been an increase in bookers across the time period we're looking at, and increase in bookings and tickets and income, all of which are pretty healthy. Quite substantial proportionate increases across the time period. Bearing in mind, this is for a consistent cohort. And I think that reflects probably lots of venues being a little bit more, or being increasingly maybe commercial, or kind of increasingly successful in audience development maybe. But some of these increases are proportionately kind of 3 or 4 times what we saw in Hampshire, for example, as a growth. So some really quite substantial growth in the local area. And what that shows then, so here we've taken all of these different measures and we've said, if we treat whatever the figure was in 2016-17 and call it 100, then proportionately what is that figure in following years? Is it above 100 and by whatever percent, or is it below 100? And pretty much everything is growing. And income has grown particularly, growing by a third, which is really quite striking. The number of bookers has grown by 20%. And there isn't, apart from the income really shifting, which is driving the kind of the relative value per customer and value per ticket and value everything as well, because it's growing faster than everything else. Everything is moving pretty solidly in a positive direction. Now, we do tend to see a bit of growth in income, not least because inflation kind of means that if it grows a little bit, it's really not growing in real terms at all. But this is way above that level. So we are seeing some substantial income growth, all of which is quite encouraging. Average ticket price, £20, is a little bit lower than we see in some other places, but again, it has grown, 6% across the time period. The bookings per booker, so how often any given person is booking, has grown a bit, albeit people have, slightly smaller bookings, but not hugely. So that's the overall trend. It's pretty strongly positive. There has been a bit of fluctuation by art form. And here we've chopped the last year of data off because some of the data didn't get art form coded because venues once we hit the end of the 1920 financial year, venues were obviously shut because of COVID and really busy and distracted and trying to rearrange and cancel shows. And therefore they weren't getting their art form coding done, understandably. So it meant the 1920 data, although it's pretty complete, I mean, it's about 70% art form coded, it's not as complete as previous years. So we didn't want to draw any conclusions about trends. Again, well, this is a third data based on that. So we can see bits of oscillation in terms of the amount of plays drama attended by people living in the area. Film appears to have dipped, and obviously this is amongst venues that are an audience finder, so it doesn't mean that film engagement in general is dipping, but it might be that less so theatres that have film programs as opposed to cinemas. And musical theatre looks like it's had a little bit of a slide, albeit it's not that high to start with, and that may reflect us not having the ATG venues in here, which might have boosted that overall number. But it might be worth reflecting on musical theatre dropping locally, as obviously one of the potential core markets. But generally speaking, everything else is fairly, steady, or on average, fairly steady. We're not seeing these kind of huge collapse of any one thing. Now here we've got the audience spectrum profile overall. And then in a second, we'll look at how that profile has changed, and it has changed in quite interesting ways. But overall, compared to the local population, it of course overrepresents the groups that are more likely to engage in arts and culture, and underrepresents, but not by a huge amount in some cases, groups that are less likely to engage. So I think it's quite notable, for example, that our street is relatively in line with the local population. So that might suggest that organisations are doing quite a lot of work in those areas, just quite centrally, but just the east centre, which I think is probably St Paul's and other areas. Some of the other groups, experience seekers, really off the scale, almost double the proportion engaging, and a really big chunk of the attending audience. So again, way over 50% for these top three groups, but a really big concentration amongst those kind of younger, highly educated young professional type groups. So that's potentially interesting. What we also then see, if we do that same trick we looked at before, where we set 2016-17 as 100 and then see how the numbers change over time, is that you see a kind of much greater growth in some groups than in others. Now what's notable here is that because the overall growth was so positive in terms of sales, and that isn't what we've seen elsewhere without any too many spoilers, but because it was overall so positive, no groups are actually decreasing in pure numbers, but what they are doing is holding still while the other groups kind of rise in proportion. So the overall mix is shifting, and shifting quite a lot. We can see kind of 40-odd% increase in trips and treats to Facebook families. So again, these tend to be the groups with much higher concentration of families within them, and more motivated by sort of good value family outings in both cases. So it seems to be the case that there is much more that's happening for those groups, or that they're engaging with better relative to other groups. So the higher engaged groups, we saw a really big chunk of the audience, but they haven't grown very much. And those groups are it seems to have taken off. Now, I don't know if that matches your experience of what's happened across the local area over recent years. So have you seen venues programming more in terms of more family-friendly work? But certainly that does seem to be the picture in terms of what audiences are doing. And we have seen growth in family audiences really across the country, but again, not to this extent. And this is really quite strong pickup. Okay. So now, if we look at, oh, yes, a reflection from someone. We excluded beacons data for anything where we've done a year-on-year comparison. Where we've done overall figures, we've kept them included. So yes, so that, for example, that last one with the trend by segment, that will have excluded the beacon, but the overall total sales figures, etc., will include it. Okay. Oops. So next up, if we look at where people are booking from, I hinted at this earlier when I said that although we're looking at audiences, not specific venues locally, audiences do tend to be local, and this really backs it up. So to probably an even greater extent than we've seen elsewhere, audiences from within this area tend to engage in this area. So 85% of all tickets going to local organisations. Right-hand pie chart is based on essentially it's that pale pink 15% then split out into proportions. Yes, and as Elise says, this includes beacon. So that 15% who are attending anywhere else, we then look on the other side and say, well, where are they attending? And for me, I think what is most notable is that you might expect that it would kind of radiate outwards. So most people attend in area, and then they, next most likely to attend just adjacently, the wider southwest, then maybe the West Midlands, and then maybe Wales, and then working outwards. You might expect the southeast to appear in here as a kind of prominent proportion, for example. There's loads of places just down the M4, etc. But actually, what we're seeing is relatively high proportion of people are jumping everything and going straight to London, which is a much higher proportion than we were seeing equivalently, for example, in Hampshire, which is close to London. And that is a higher proportion than the proportion of people who are actually going to the rest of the southwest. So broadly speaking, compared to other regions, and Elise will correct me if I am talking through my hat, but I think it is a higher proportion staying locally, albeit not enormously higher. So it's a bit higher. It's
quite a high proportion. We've seen some places with that say even more local, but this is one of the higher ones we've seen doing this analysis. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And worth noting, as we say along the bottom there, that if we just look at the survey responses, which will tend towards museums and galleries, but not exclusively, the audiences are a little bit less local. So you're getting a little bit more reach. So I guess you're more likely to be pulling in more of a tourist audience for those. Maybe the region offer is so good people don't have the need to travel. I think there's probably a lot in that. I think the other thing is that you don't have major competitors drawing in terms of equivalently sized cities for a relative distance, with the exception of, I guess, flights of Cardiff where there's a bridge in the way. So whereas you might see in other areas, so for example, we saw all sorts of tussling going on in the East Midlands between the three big cities there, Nottingham, Leicester and Derby, where lots of people travelling between those, but equally they spilt out quite quickly in other directions to be competing with Sheffield, competing with Stoke, or you don't have quite the same effect going on. So, Bristol is much more of a cultural draw than Cheltenham or Gloucester or any of those kind of nearby places. Even, dare I say it, in my hometown of Reading. So I guess you could get a bit more of a concentration, which in a way is a kind of equivalent thing to what you get in the northeast with the kind of Tyne and Wear conurbation, where once you're outside that really kind of rich cultural centre, there's a lot of stuff that faces that way because it's too far to get to the next nearest cities. So that's probably a bit of what's going on. And maybe also with quite a distinctive population, with high concentrations of metroculturals and experience seekers, you've probably got programming that's fitting more towards the kind of innovative, experimental, kind of quite sort of probably a bit more cutting edge stuff, and therefore that's likely to be better catered for locally than it is from other places which have lower proportions of those people anyway. Yes, that's interesting. So maybe less so for Bath. Although we're about to see something interesting with Bath, which was really touching that point, which I'd be kind of interested to see people's reactions to this. So where do people travel to London from? So it looks, from I think from what we're seeing, that Bristol is often doing the big draw thing for big names in many ways. But yeah, let's have a look. So London being more of a draw than other local regions, I think is quite interesting. And it certainly seems to me that there's a stronger kind of link between Bristol and London than equivalently distant sister cities. I don't know if that feels true. That probably would have a bit of an impact in terms of cultural offer. Okay. Ooh. Makes sense for the travel networks. Yes, that's true. The old Great Western, etc. So this is where the bookers are booking from. So as a proportion of households, this is where they're concentrated. And again, we see that really stark, west of Bristol, much higher than the east. Bath is really high in general. It drops off really quite a lot when you get towards Avonmouth, I said, yeah. So here's a bit of a contrast. You do have substantial pockets coming from North Somerset, albeit much lower population densities. So, they're relatively culturally engaged, but there just aren't as many of them. So that's the overall picture. So this one really surprised and intrigued me. Now we have to be a little bit cautious because it will depend on the the venues that are in the data set. But what we looked at was for every ward, did they have a higher number of people booking for venues in Bristol or venues in Bath? And I was fully expecting to see Bristol pretty much sweeping the board, kind of pushing Bath right in, and so most of this being really sort of solidly purple. But actually, relatively speaking, Bath is holding its own. So what you're seeing is the Bristol audience is very much, it's the city and there's everything kind of west, north and south, but it's not pushing heavily over towards Bath to the same extent, which isn't to say people aren't coming from there, but that more of the people in those areas are going to Bath. So that slightly surprised me. I don't know whether it would surprise you. Again, you'll probably have more immediate local insights on it. But it's certainly, we maybe would have expected Bristol to be sweeping the board to a much greater extent. And Elise, we've got a substantial number of venues in both places, haven't we? So it's not just that one of them. We have disproportionately loads of venues in Bath. We've got more in Bristol, but still.
Yeah, only a few more in Bristol. It was quite an even split. Again, this is including Bristol Beacon.
So I don't know if anyone has any reflection on that, if they sort of see Bath as having quite a sort of a strong grip on its local audience, or
Hello, sorry, are we allowed to talk?
Hi,
I came in late.
oh, hi. So who is that?
This is Beth. Hi. It includes all the stuff, like it includes everything, doesn't it? Like National Trust properties and all that kind of thing.
It's anyone that's in audience finder this.
I know this Friday ticketing specifically.
Sorry.
So it's ticketing, yes.
Yes,
Ticketing.
not
Okay.
surveys.
Yeah. So they don't so much. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting.
Cool.
That's as far as my insight goes, I'm afraid.
No, fair
That's
enough.
all right. But I will say that for once, ticketing information does include a few non sort of theatre venues. There's a few museums in there as well. So it is a bit of a varied picture. Yeah.
An interesting Celia's point that it's travel times. Actually,
Yeah,
they're close together, but not. Yes. I think in my head, and this is absolutely a product of me growing up in Reading, like Bath Spa, Bristol Temple Meads is like almost one word. So in my head, they're so adjacent, it's just like one thing. But yes, of course, not everyone is on the mainline train. And yes, the road networks aren't working as well. Yeah, so I think the train is super quick, but yeah, stops early. That's interesting. That is weirdly early. So yes, so again, that might be one where it could be that travel thing and that kind of thing of when's the last train question is something that is having a bit of a strategic impact in terms of cultural engagement, in which case that's the kind of thing I guess you might want to talk to the mayor's office about and say, we think this has a cultural impact and therefore we could increase the effective catchment area of local venues if more was done about that. I know that's a conversation that's happening in some other mayoral areas. So this would be the 2016-17 to 19-20 data. So it would be sort of pre and post closure. So that's a good point. So Elise, in that instance, anything that was ticketed through Bristol Beacon would show against the
Bristol, which show in purple.
Bristol data set. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, because this
So in
is
some
based
ways,
on source organizations rather than divided by venues in the ticketing data.
Yeah. And there's a reasonable question about, yes, as Hilary says, would it make that much impact? But if anything, that would increase the proportion of purple showing in the green patch.
Yeah.
Because you would be expecting those tendencies to be actually showing being elsewhere, even if they weren't.
Yeah.
We're changing the closure of the edge. So if a call works up, you'll have to come to Bristol. Yes, so that might have a future impact, but also it would accentuate the picture that's already here. No, it wouldn't. No, that would then have greater encroachment. Yeah. So yeah. But yes, I was a bit surprised by that. I think it might reflect on the various of these things we've seen. We are also looking at trying to do this kind of equivalent aggregate picture right across the country and then start to see what the patterns are. Which once we've done that, again, you might start to see some really interesting pictures in terms of there might be people leapfrogging to Bristol from other areas where, if you're, I think that's Cheltenham, isn't it? Out east, Cheltenham. It could be that people are, you wouldn't travel out and then go to an equivalently sized small city. You might go straight to the big city, in which case you might see this kind of a mottled picture. Yes, that's a good point. That is a really good point. So lots of community land culture buffs in the Bath area. They're well served by the kind of traditional fare that's there. They probably quite like Bath as a place to hang out, as a place to go and spend the afternoon and then go to the theatre or whatever else. So that probably works quite well. And Bristol is probably more actively catering towards the other groups anyway. So you'll probably see them split that way. That's a really good point. I love it when things make sense once you apply local knowledge. So thank you all. Okay, so this is just, we've split out the Bristol and Bath, so you can see that that it's not just about where the other city is drawing from. So Bristol isn't getting many people from this area around Bath, all things considered. It really is quite concentrated. So it's not being outcompeted, it's just not really doesn't have a huge audience there. Then when you flip the other way, Again, a very similar picture, very heavily concentrated, quite centrally, but notably those areas west of Bristol, Clifton, etc. There are still relatively reasonable numbers of people who are coming out to stuff in Bath. Those groups are very highly culturally engaged. You'd expect them to be going everywhere. Basically, there is offer available. So yes, so that's sort of maybe as you'd expect. But here's the one that surprised me, or another one that surprised me. Again, it'll be interesting to know how much it surprised you. I would have assumed that there would be more of a pull towards London from Bath, partly because it's a bit closer, partly because they've got a whole sort of spa town idea that people kind of going to Bath but still having a bit of an eye on London or kind of roots in London. But actually, it seems like there are more people going to London-based organisations from Bristol, and again, those patches of West Bristol, as opposed to Bath. That will partly just be sheer force of population. More density packed in the bigger city. But nonetheless, I thought it sort of notable. And we are talking relatively reasonable numbers, albeit obviously smaller numbers than the local figures. So up to 1,300 people from any given ward booking to London. So Bath surely has more actual commuters to London. Yeah. So DFLs by being what sorts down for London? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If Bristol's younger and edgier than Bath, they still see London's a cool place to go, whereas Bath's older and more settled, and therefore they've had their fill of London, or that's possibly true. It could also be, maybe about frequency of engagement rather than overall value of engagement. It could be that young groups are going more often, but maybe spending less. But yes, so that's interesting. So you do seem to have this quite strong Bristol-London link, particularly when you consider the distances. Bearing in mind that I think isn't Bristol the same distance from London as Sheffield is, but feels enormously closer to London in every other respect. Once in Bath, always in Bath, clearly, yes. I'm sure there's a joke there about spending too long in Bath and getting wrinkly. Anyway, yes, Hotel California. With all, oh no, Cluedo, yes. So we also looked from the survey data, because obviously, there's a different mixture of people going to the venues with the surveys, and looked to see the proportion of people that said that they were a first-time visitor, someone that had been previously in the last 12 months, that we've slightly misleadingly here called frequent, but they were recently engaged, or people who said they have been before, but not in the last 12 months. And yeah, so we're seeing again a bit of a mixed picture. So overall, most people are going to places that they've been to before. So that's the 49% of the overall Bristol surrounding area. But a bit of a contrast between places. Bath has a higher proportion of people who are visiting for the first time. So of course, what's going on there is they probably it's a bigger tourist audience. It's some of the heritage sites in Bath, I guess, are kind of really big destination type kind of the baths in Bath, etc. is quite a big thing. People will travel quite a long way to them, and so that's not something they're going to do frequently. It's a one-off thing. Whereas for example, things like city museums in Bristol, you're more likely to have an ongoing relationship with the local audience who are engaging frequently, and therefore are appearing in that kind of middle group. Yeah, so a bit of a contrast in terms of who's engaging with each, and also relatedly, how far people are travelling. So much higher average drive times for some than others. Yes, and that's a very fair question, Becky, in terms of lapsed. I think you're right. It varies by art form, and there's so much churn in audiences. I'm pretty wary about calling someone lapsed really within 3 years, because people drop in 1 year and out another. So the really pragmatic reason for the way we call them frequent and lapsed is just the way that someone set up the coding on the Servo data warehouse. But yes, that's why I've really spelled it out here, because I think you're right that it's better to think about it is within a year and not within a year. Indeed, I think it will probably save everyone else's time if we changed it rather than have to explain it. So, mental note, let's do that. What would you recommend as a lapse at 10 to 3 years? I mean, I think if we had to pick a number in a completely sort of generic across the board sense, then yes. I think for some things, so things that were relatively expensive or infrequent or sort of one-off type things, then I think you could reasonably look at sort of 5 years as still being someone that hasn't lapsed. But for stuff that's super regular, I think, you know, you'd probably want the lapse time to be much shorter than that. So things like, I mean, arguably things like library visits, for example. If someone hasn't been to the local library for a year, then they're probably not currently in the mode of going to the local library, in which case it's probably is useful to talk about that being lapsed, even though that doesn't mean they're not going to go to the local library when it's not been that long since they've been. So yes, of course, right now, lapsedness is in complete chaos because we've got 2 years of apparently lapsed workers everywhere. So that's a really tricky one for us to navigate. But yes, if that makes sense as a generic kind of picture. But the other thing which, you know, where you have your own data is literally work out the proportion that would count as lapsed over any given time period, and you can use that from your own proportion to say, by the time we think half the people then just haven't come back, you know, what's that time period? What's that look like? Although that feels like some extra analysis that we could be doing internally as a little project, Elise. Yeah, lapsedness. Okay. So if people are happy, I'm going to push through without breaking, just because we're it feels like we're having quite a nice conversation. So let's keep that bubbling. So we also looked at what people have done in terms of the population monitor. So during the different waves of the survey, we asked people, have you done these things in person, various different art forms? Have you done these things online, various different art forms? Have you done these sort of participatory activities in various different ways? And if we then look for the Southwest, because that's the smallest geography we can get to with samples big enough to kind of hold up, essentially there's not much difference in the national picture. I mean, yeah, there's a percentage here and there, but it's well within the margin of error. So essentially it's pretty in line with the national population. So really those headline figures are the thing that's most important here. So you know, about 2/3 of people have done something in person in terms of arts cultural engagement, but it was much lower in 2020 than in 2021. Indeed, even in the 2 months, sort of September, October, almost the same proportion of people were engaging as had done the rest of that year put together. So, you know, very clearly sort of a bit of an opening up effect going on there. And online, again, it's a similar picture. I mean, possibly slightly lower compared to the national average, but it's really too close to draw any firm conclusions. And of course, in the context of this more localized area that we're looking at, this is probably skewed by large rural areas in the Southwest, lots of home and heritage, lots of older groups who are less engaged online. So that's probably what's driving that. And conversely, that's already also driving greater participatory engagement, which we'll see in a sec. Again, a similar picture once we look at particular different art forms and activities people have done. So, you know, we've seen relatively high levels of museum and heritage attendance relative to other things, but you know, that's probably because, you know, the ability to freely move in spaces. but there's not a great difference geographically in that picture. And then, in terms of online activity, as we've seen more generally, a very high proportion of overall engagement online out of this range of things we've asked people has been about watching stuff online. Elise, I don't know if you remember the exact figures from the thing the other week, but it was something like a third of people who engaged online had only engaged in streaming. Is that right?
Something like that, yeah. And about half of those, it was the only activity they did.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really prominent within the mixture of things. What we have seen, and again we've done more on this elsewhere, is that where people are engaging digitally, it's a relatively small people who are starting to do digital things that for the first time. It's about sort of 7% of people. Generally speaking, where there were increases in digital engagement, it was people who are already digitally engaged doing more, as opposed to particularly converting new people, with some detailed exceptions. So this is just showing that it looks like there's slightly higher levels of participatory engagement, but again, that could be as much skewed by the older profile of audiences in the Southwest, but actually outside of this region, as opposed to here more locally. There was quite a big spike in people reading for pleasure in the course of the pandemic, relative to before. So yes, it was one of the sectors that in some ways had a stronger pandemic than others was publishers, who started off really worried about the impact of bookshops closing, but then they saw a spike in readership and more online sales, and actually ended up ahead on the year as opposed to behind. Okay. And then we also asked people if they had attended, what do they think of the measures they saw, and or which measures do people find important. The overall picture, very similar to the overall population. People are basically happy with the measures that they've seen where they've attended, and if anything, they want more rather than less. Obviously, this is back from November, so it will have changed by now, but we will find that out in the next couple of weeks, so watch this space. The overall regional picture, again, isn't radically different from people in general, but broadly speaking, people are very keen on most measures, at least were at this stage, very keen on most measures. So we've seen quite a strong persistence in terms of people being quite cautious in terms of COVID measures. Again, we'll see very shortly whether that's changed, but my hunch is that it probably won't have caught up as much as possibly we may have otherwise expected. So that's a kind of overall picture. And now for this one, we asked people, once COVID had gone away, do you expect to attend more of this art form in future, or less, or about the same? And this is showing the difference between the people that said more as opposed to said less. And for those that want to get into technicalities, it's also weighted. So if they said a little bit more, we've counted it half, etc. So here we are seeing a bit of a difference. So the broad picture is people overall are expecting to do less of indoor cultural activities post-COVID. And this is pre-cost of living crisis, or at least pre the latest wave of the cost of living crisis, but also pre-Omicron. But this was people trying to project into the future beyond COVID. So overall, people are expected to do less, particularly indoors, particularly sitting down indoors, particularly stuff that's quite, if you like, more replaceable as an activity like film, where you can at least watch film at home in a way that you can't directly with live films. But it was more pronounced in this area as opposed to overall. But again, this could be skewed by the wider Southwest rather than this pocket. What we have seen is that the groups who are most urban, most highly engaged, like the metrocultural experience seekers, are expecting, if anything, to do more rather than less in future. So those groups you have big pockets of in Bristol itself, for example, or indeed actually even centre of Bath as well. You may actually see them engaging more as opposed to less. But again, it might be a bit of a skew towards those segments and also towards families. So we're seeing people who have dependent children in the household being more likely to say they'll do more stuff as opposed to less stuff. So those two groups, and bearing in mind that long-term trend we saw where the family groups were rising in prominence anyway, it could well be that more family activity, more family programming could well kind of, if you like, catch that wave. But also those kind of really key core audiences you've already got look to be quite promising. That does also potentially mean that that's an easier situation in Bristol than it is in Bath. This kind of, having higher concentrations of some groups in one place compared to the other. We did also see people saying that by and large they're expecting to attend more close to home. And that picture was also more pronounced for those urban high engaged groups, which also means you're less likely to see people spilling out from Bristol to Bath, because if they're highly engaged, then what they're going to engage more, but they engage more locally, they're probably going to stay put. So you might see this sort of concentration in the urban centres. Yes, so a combination of that and from the audiences are probably the big trend you see. So, does anyone have any queries or comments on any of that? Obviously, for touring companies, this will affect a range of different places you're touring to, not just obviously the region you're based in. But we are seeing a similar picture across other cities and indeed towns. So depending the type of product you're touring, it may well be that audiences are relatively stronger in cities than towns in many cases. There maybe might have been the kind of background expectation. But yeah. Yes, I think that's very, very true, Beth. That more local thing. It'll be interesting to see how persistent it is, but I suspect it might well, persist. I certainly remember a moment of slight, surprise at myself partway through COVID, and someone made some reference to the City Museum in Sheffield, and I was like, yeah, but that's miles away. That's the other side of the city. That's not local. I was like, well, it's still, it's only actually a couple of miles, really, but it's just not this side. And I suspect that kind of hyper-local thing, it might reinvigorate certain very local spaces. If you had a venue completely starting again from scratch, would you recommend not doing film due to decline? That's a question. You'll say need more research. I always say need more research. I'm a researcher. But joking aside, I think film's tricky because the economic model is different from performing arts. So in that sense, you can afford to have lower audiences in a given space. So it's more flexible by volume of attendance than performing arts would be. Performing arts falls off a cliff quite quickly when you get capacities below a certain level. So I wouldn't necessarily say not to do it. I think I would suggest skewing just a little bit more toward, not hugely, but a little bit more towards the kind of family and or indie programming than maybe otherwise would have been the case, but only a bit, probably. And maybe sort of keeping it in the mix with other things as opposed to just freestanding. But one of the challenges we have is that we have quite a lot of film data in Audience Finder, because lots of organizations do some film, but what we don't have is lots of the big film chains, because they tend to run on different box office systems, because the whole film sector just has its own little data ecology. So we don't get that close a look at some of that film data, which is a bit tricky. Hopefully one day we'll find a way of doing that. So yes, you have a venue, by the way, Becky, as well as touring. It was like a home base, or Yes, that's a really good point, Adam. How many screens at once make a difference? Ah, there you are then. Yes. I'll be more likely to visit a small local cinema than a multiplex. Yes, I think that is probably true. And I think there's also something about people feeling more inclined to support their local ecology. So we asked, for example, in one way with the Monitor about, do you consider that the arts and culture are a cause that's worth supporting, either individually or having public support? And has that changed since COVID? Do you feel like you're more likely to support it or less? And we saw, across the board, across all sorts of different types of people were saying, yes, the arts are more of a good cause. The needle had moved on that. So I think there is a kind of greater goodwill and a greater sense of, if you don't have, I guess people have been aware of the precarity of lots of the cultural provision. So maybe there's a bit of a, is going out film a dying art form now we have Netflix and sick of screen time? Possibly. I suspect there's still previously cinemas felt safer, maybe they don't now. I mean, cinemas are sometimes emptier, if that's the kind of, if you're thinking about feeling crowded, but not necessarily reliably. I think part of the challenge, and I guess you've seen the cinemas adapting to this over the years anyway, is needing to differentiate the live cinema experience from the kind of at-home experience. So, all the emphasis on big screens, surround sounds, and 3D and whatever else is all part of that attempt to, I guess, make it stack up as a kind of, you can't just do this at home. But yes, it is a bit tricky. We certainly saw, we saw in the Monitor Disney Plus go absolutely through the roof in terms of subscriptions. Which is quite, they were just incredibly lucky with when they launched. As much as it's like a week after they launched, suddenly there was lockdowns, and a third of the 30% of families within 6 months had signed up for Disney Plus. So we've seen loads of these metrocultural and experience seekers, these high engaged groups, and that seems to be resulting in a distinctive behaviour patterns, but also lots of the middle engaged groups, particularly as you head further north out of Bristol. And the family groups are the ones that appear to be growing fastest over sort of pre-COVID years, but in the context of everything, it seems to be going in a really positive direction. So that's something to bear in mind. We've chatted quite a bit about the relationship between Bath and Bristol and how those work. And London is this kind of Bristol-London link. It's kind of an interesting one. There's a bit more caution in terms of COVID, or was, and I think the key thing to remember on that is that it's about relative rather than absolute levels. So we know the circumstances have changed since November, but if people in general were a little bit more cautious, then maybe that's just overall caution. But again, that's probably weighted by the rural southwest as opposed to the cities, as we've just discussed. So yes, and some marginal differences in terms of during COVID engagement, but again, that's about the wider geographical area. So we will try and pull out a few key points that we've touched on and add them into the slides before we share them, just to kind of show there's other viewpoints. But broadly speaking, and I put out 4 groups here, but really it's the first 3 of these that are half the population. So the experience seekers, absolutely huge, linked to the student population, but not exclusively. But also, it's the kind of retained student population as well. And they're relatively keen to come back out and attend. A lot of this is also true of the metroculturals, who are, 7%, so it's not huge, but it's more than elsewhere. Big concentrations of these middle engaged family groups, which are, they have been growing, or there is potential because they're not too averse in terms of engagement. There is potential in terms of, I think, some of the lower engaged family groups, like Facebook families, in the sense that They have been growing quite quickly. Both of these two on the right hand side have been growing quite quickly over previous years. But of course, as we see the cost of living crisis bite, we'll see when, how much of an impact that has. But it does potentially mean there could be a kind of an accentuation of inequality that we know the COVID has been driving in any case.